And we're live. Hello, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. Welcome to Debut Spotlight. I'm the author of the brand new novel, Atomic Anna, and I cannot tell you how excited I am about our guest today, Boris Dralyuk. I have been a fan of his for years, since his book 1917 came out, and I stalked him on the campus at Dartmouth to hear him lecture and get his signature in my copy. I absolutely love his work, his brilliant translations, and today we're here to celebrate his debut poetry collection. Here it is in all of its glory, My Hollywood. Boris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm as much a fan of yours as you're a fan of mine.
Oh, I love it. All right. So, for those of you listening, I'm going to read his biography briefly so you get a chance to understand how amazing Boris is. And then we'll jump right into some questions. So, Boris is the editor in chief of the Los Angeles Review of Books, my absolute favorite publication, by the way. He's co editor of the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry, editor of 1917 Stories and Poems from the Russian Revolution. I highly recommend that book if you don't have a copy now. And 10 Poems from Russia, and translator of Isaac Babel, Mikhail Zochenko, I probably butchered that, and other authors. My Hollywood is his debut poetry collection from Paul Dry Books, which is a publication, an imprint and editor that I absolutely adore, a publishing house out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, my hometown. So, Boris, thank you so much. Can you tell me, what is this collection about? What unifies it?
Well, yes, I think the collection is largely about the experience of emigres writ large, but especially emigres to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles being a kind of transient city through which so many populations have passed, in which so many populations have attempted to set down roots, is a perfect venue for the exploration of emigration and exile. I myself am an immigrant to Los Angeles, and some of the poems are personal, some are historically rooted. All of them take, in one way or another, the theme of alienation and immigration as their subject.
And My Hollywood? Why the Hollywood highlight?
Well, because Hollywood is the part of Los Angeles that I know best. It's where I grew up. Technically West Hollywood, but I spent plenty of time in East Hollywood and Central Hollywood. It's not such a big place, Hollywood, but of course it looms large in the imagination. But the Hollywood that I wanted to show readers is the real nitty gritty of life in Hollywood itself, the streets of Hollywood, not the glitz and glamour.
Yeah, I love it. So, one of the reasons that I'm such a fan of your work is your control and understanding of language is really unparalleled. And you, of course, are known for your translations. So, I'd just love to introduce my listeners today to this idea of you as the translator. Can you talk about what kind of translating work you do and what languages you work in?
Sure. I work largely with Russian. I tend to work with authors of the early 20th century. I'm really drawn to that period. It's the language I feel I know best, although I grew up in a Russian-speaking family in Ukraine in the 1980s, and we immigrated in the 1990s. I feel that the language that was spoken in my household somehow had more in common with the language of the 1920s, with the work of Isaac Babel, the work of Mikhail Zochenko, whose name you got pretty damn right, and other authors that are very near and dear to me. So that's the Russian language tradition with which I work, and I translate it into some version of the language of the 1920s or 30s or 40s that was spoken here in the United States, and that I also love. I love through the work of Ring Lardner. I love it through the work of Damon Runyon and various other authors that caught my attention when I was at a tender, impressionable age.
So when you sit down to translate, I've been dying to ask you this for a long time. How do you sort of get into the zone? Do you do anything or just sit down?
Well, yeah, I think that there's no better way to start than to sit down and do it, of course. But breaking the ice is hard. So I think it takes me a few pages into a text before I really, strike on some detail that gives me a perfect sense that I found the vehicle for for what I've seen in the Russian text or what I've seen in the original text. And so once that clicks, once I find the right word, the right phrasing, the right order of words for a particularly juicy line, a line that's rich in not just in content but in flavor, then I know that I'm doing it right. And once that clicks, I begin to build in my head the speaker of the voice that I need for this translation. I like a method actor, become the person who would write such a thing in English, and go on from there.
Even the way you described that, the words you chose for that, they were just beautiful. And is poetry the same way? Do you think it takes you a while to get into a poem? How do you approach it in a different way?
That's a very good question. So I do. I mean, given my druthers, I would definitely translate poetry 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's what draws me most. I do love prose, but the kinds of prose that I tend to be drawn to is also very rich in voice, poetic, one might say. With poems, I think of the total experience of the poem. A poem is a bit of a three-dimensional object. Although it sits flatly on the page, it doesn't work just left to right or right to left, or vertically or horizontally. It works in all directions at once, ideally, especially a lyric poem. Maybe not epic poetry, but lyric poetry does that. So when you enter into the space of a poem, you kind of have the whole experience at once. That differentiates it from prose. Prose is immersive. You immerse yourself, and you can go in and out. But it's a world that's sustained over time. With a poem, it's like a punch in the gut. It's just right there, all at once. And that's what I think appeals to me most about the process of translating poetry, is that not only am I getting punched, but I'm also punching back in a way. I'm creating something that has real impact, that's immediate and intense.
Right. So you have, of course, translated poems in this beautiful collection, but also original poems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I see that many of them are started with an epigram or a quote, right, from another author. Are these people that you read before you sit down to write your poetry? How do you get into that headspace?
That's great. Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of the poems do carry these epigraphs that are setters of the scene, and in a way they serve as a lead in, and in a way they served that function for me as the poet. I would encounter something in an old book, let's say a novella by Horace McCoy, or even an old newspaper article, and that would trigger memories, emotional memories of the places described. And that combination of textual encounter and the recollection of intense memory, or intense experience, that is what gave rise to the poem. So somewhere between the text and the lived life, basically where I live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And I feel so lucky that I have your attention here and I can ask you all these questions that I've been dying to ask you for a while. So another one that I'm fascinated with when it comes to translation and when it comes to people who grow up with more than one language in their head is this trouble that we face sometimes when there's a word that doesn't quite translate, right?
Uh-huh.
The obvious is I don't know if you know French, right? You could say the word chez in French, right, to English, right? There's no direct translation. There are tons of words, but that I was thinking is familiar. But then there are also words like expressions like mazel tov, we might say in Hebrew, which has come to be very light, right? And people use it all the time here in English, in America in English. But if you use it, if you're Israeli, you're a Hebrew speaker, there's a weight to it that is lost in the fact that it's now part of our pop culture, right?
That's right.
So how do you as a translator deal with these nuances when it's not just the word for word?
Yeah, well, for me, it's never the word for word. It's never an exchange of mathematical data.
Sure.
For me, no word exists in isolation. All words exist in their context. So, what's important is not what mazel tov means in isolation. What's important is what it means in the mouth of the person saying it. And so, translating that phrase or a phrase like that depends on my understanding. My translation will depend on my understanding of how it came to be in this text, where it's coming from, what's the emotion behind it, what's the thought behind it, what isn't being said as much as what is being said, what is the character striving to say. In Chekhov's plays, people say all kinds of nonsense that has nothing to do with what they actually mean, but somehow we see what they mean behind those words. It's magic. And in a way, all texts are like this. Chekhov is just putting it front and center. But really, all speech is as much about what isn't said as it is about what is said. And the translator's job, as is the job of any good reader or any good viewer of theater, is to deduce the full range of what stands behind a small utterance.
Yes, so beautifully said. It's what isn't said that is always sometimes most important. Okay, so let's dive into the text itself. I wanted to ask you. So there are a couple of sections in here, right? You've separated it into My Hollywood, right? Absentee Ballet, Russian Hollywood, your translations, and then Late Style. So can you talk about why those sections, how you divided it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I wanted the book to be, well, I'll just say it. I wanted it to be entertaining. And in
I
order
mean, it's
for,
appropriate,
yeah,
right? It's My
exactly,
Hollywood.
exactly. It's Hollywood after all. There's no business like show business, and I wanted it to have a little bit of that quality. You know, a good film is well paced. There is slow cinema. There's European cinema, and then there's there's the Hollywood spectacle, which is always a certain number of minutes, and something happens in the middle and something happens in the end. That's how it works. And I wanted to structure the book not necessarily formulaically, but I wanted it to have that kind of rise and fall quality where just when you get comfortable with a certain theme, I wanted to switch it up, switch up the approach, give a little bit of variety to the reading experience, and then bring you back to something more familiar that you encountered a while ago. So first, my poems of Hollywood, then some more abstract poems that have less to do with the theme of the book, then back to these translations of someone else's Hollywood, the Hollywood of these Russian-speaking poets.
Who lived in Hollywood,
Who
right?
all lived
Who
in
spent
Hollywood,
the end
exactly.
of their days, right, in
Yeah,
Hollywood.
all of
Yeah.
them, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so they are connected to the land. And then you finish with Late Style, and the thought there is
That's the end of the book. You're coming
yeah.
to closure, and it's a little bit, of course, ironic because it's a small book and it's the first book, so why be so dour about it? But I wanted to draw the curtains.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
love it. Well, I
close.
mean, it is so there are not as many pages as a big, thick novel, right? But I mean, every word in poetry has a weight that is much greater than that in fiction.
Yeah, I
So,
think so. I hope so,
yeah,
at least. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
even if it were flimsy, I'd still be proud of it.
I mean, this is not flimsy.
Okay.
So I warned Boris beforehand that I was going to ask him to read one of his poems from to us. So would you mind? Would you do us that honor?
I wouldn't mind at all. This is I'll read a poem about a story that meant a lot to me as a young man when we first immigrated to Los Angeles in 1991. I was 8 years old, and well, to say that we didn't have much money would be an exaggeration. We were brought here by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society on a loan, and I still had a lot of fun despite our lack of funds. But that was largely due to the fact that in the United States, you can buy anything for pennies. At that time, you could buy anything for pennies, and the best place to do it was at this shop called Bargain Circus. This describes the shop, and I'll read the epigraph first. Bargain Circus. So it goes at Bargain Circus, perhaps LA's most whimsical discount store. The eclectic selection of goods and guilt-inducing low prices draw a melange of Orthodox Jews, Russians, Armenians, and West Side connoisseurs. Los Angeles Times, 1997. Clown prince of bargain shops, those penny Annie Xanadu's that take up half a block, was the La Brea Circus. Huge barn chock full of overstock, a poor man's horn of plenty. Where we, though broke as sparrows, like canaries, flitted about, whistled with disbelief at deals, no steals that would abash a thief. Big pens for nickels, dollar dictionaries. I wore my Webster's out, clumsily wooing the tongue in which I sing this dime store's praise. But they're worn too, my memories of those days, like VHS tapes after years of viewing and spooling backwards to the sweetest spot. Oh yes, that was another thing we bought. A plastic sports car VHS rewinder, so obsolete, so perfectly designed for its vanished purpose, like a streamlined hearse, inexorably heading in reverse.
Beautiful. just beautiful.
Thank
And the
you.
way it ties together, I really think poetry, these poems in particular, are meant to be read out loud, right? There's
I
a
hope so.
rhythm to them.
Yeah, there's a rhythm, and I would even go so far as to say there's a meter. And I'm very fond of fixed forms because they allow me to say something twice. You're not just saying the prose message. You're also working against the resistance of the form, and the rhyme words tell a story of their own. So there are more possibilities for me, at least, in form.
Yeah. And amazing too. I mean, you bring us right back to the moment with VHS tapes because
Yeah.
many people can relate to that,
I
right?
hope so. I mean, someday they won't be. It's but at least the people living today, most of the people living today who are my age or older, still remember VHS
And
tapes.
younger.
And younger, sure, sure. I'm not. That's true.
Yeah, yeah. That it's just great. So, as you're putting this collection together, are you reading them out loud to other people, to yourself? How were you thinking about it?
Well, I do read them. I mean, I hear them in my head certainly, and I read them out loud as I work on them. I
Mhm.
practice lines. I don't have, I'm not the best reader of my own work or of anybody's work for that matter. But I
You
enjoy the
sounded
fact.
pretty good.
Oh, thank you. I was fishing for that one. But I do enjoy the fact that every time I read a poem out loud, I discover some new way of interpreting it. A new word onto which I could place emphasis and change the meaning ever so slightly. So I do enjoy that. But of course, I also enjoy sitting at home quietly reading poems to myself without making so much as a whisper.
Right. I mean, I read all of my books to my dog. He's
Oh, that's
heard
great.
everything,
That's
right? All the
great.
bad drafts.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
So, publishing anything, of course, is very hard. But I will say that publishing poetry, I feel like, is an uphill battle like no other. It is very
Yeah.
hard. And so many of these poems have been published in other places before they came together as a collection, right?
Yes.
So was that is that sort of the strategy to putting the book and a collection together, or do the individual poems come first and then you sort of pick and choose and put them into a collection?
I think a little bit of both. Some of the poems are very old, and when I originally composed them, I don't think I had any sense of what the collection would look like. But a number of the poems, especially in the first section, were written with a collection in mind. I really understood that I didn't know exactly what it would look like, but I understood I was working on something that was larger than a single poem, that had shape to it that I would discover as I worked. And I'd say publishing them individually was a kind of confirmation. If I got a good response from an editor that I admired, then I knew that I was on the right track.
Right. I bet. Okay, so I want to skip back to another idea that we had touched on earlier, of course, the catch on translation, which is a
Uh,
poem in your collection on page 41 for anyone who's listening and holding your book. It's a shorter one, but it's one that really caught me. I told you that I would read it, but is there any chance you would read it for me?
Gladly, gladly,
Yeah, okay, great,
absolutely.
because that would be much better.
Oh, sure, no
Thank you.
problem. Yeah, the catch on translation. I draw you out, faint voice, from rippled pages, a famished angler reeling in a fish, the kind that in the folk tale grants a wish, a golden thing imbued with living magic. Between us is the taut line of attention, imperiled by the current and the wind. Slowly but willfully, I reel you in. We hold each other for a moment in suspension.
I just love this one so much. This idea, right? Even when you finish, we hold each other for a moment in suspension of disbelief as we sit down and read poetry, as we
Yeah,
read books, right?
yeah, very
Stories,
much
all of
so.
it. But
Very
also in
much so.
language, right? There's a
Yes,
suspension.
suspended between languages, and that's I think it was that occurred to me when translating. If something is going very right, you do feel that you speak the same language as the poet, and it's neither Russian nor English. It's a kind of interlanguage that is the language of this particular poem, and that's a kind of suspension you're for the moment of translating this work, you're in between with only one person, that poet with whom you're working.
Yeah. Yeah, the space of the in between, a very loaded, right,
Yeah,
expression, but it applies to so many different things, to
very
politics,
much
to
so.
philosophy,
Oh yeah,
and to language.
absolutely.
And I just, because I also think if you are a successful writer, or if you understand what people are saying, words melt away, and you get straight to the meaning, to the idea in your head, right? This image. So I always joke when I'm learning, if I'm learning a new language, I'll say like, well, I don't always get the grammar right, but I get the idea,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
right? So we're
Absolutely.
there. And I
and
felt
and,
like
and it's true, and it's not just, it's not just an image necessarily. I do believe that there are images at play, and it's important to be able to imagine the thing that's being described when you're translating, to visually imagine it. I think um, a lot of translations work well, especially well when the translator has clearly taken the time to visualize the subject of what they're writing about, what they're translating. But it's not, language isn't just imagery. I think that the more complicated element is this nuanced emotional landscape of a poem. That's where the magic happens. That's the in between.
Mhm.
That's what that's communicated through the words, or is conjured by the words, but is not fully explained by the words.
Right, or a feeling. I mean, as we see very sad news coming out of Ukraine right now, right? You might may not understand all the words people are saying, but
Yeah.
you see those images and you still understand what is happening, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes you read words that don't necessarily communicate clearly to you, but you feel what's behind them. You feel what they're bringing up. They're conjuring.
Yeah. Okay, the time is just flying. I have like 1,000 more questions for you, but I wanted to go to there's one other poem in here in specific that I wanted to ask you about. It's on page 47, and it is one of your translations.
Hmm.
So it is by Vladimir Korvin Piotrovsky.
Hmm.
It's called Exiles Return,
Yeah.
and it starts. Would you mind reading? I really don't want to, just from to perform to flags at half mast on the stern.
Yes, I don't mind that at all. Sure.
Thank
Exiles
you.
Return.
This is such a treat for me. Thank you so much.
Don't get, no. You're giving me a big head. To perform a final honor, a sleek cruiser from Kronstadt sails into the silent harbor slowly, like a juggernaut. Ready for its distant journey, taking leave of foreign lands, comes a lightweight coffin swaying through a sea of lowered heads. Were we right or wrong? No matter. Flags at half-mast on the stern.
I just this just stopped me, and I ran around my house reading this to everyone who was here that day. My kids, their friends,
The
my
dog.
husband, the dog, of course the
Yeah.
dog. um just this question, right? So you see the sleek cruiser from Kronstadt coming
Yeah.
in. Were we right or wrong? No
Yeah.
matter. At the end of the day, they're all dead.
They're all dead. Exactly. This is a poem by a man who had fought against the Bolsheviks and was taken prisoner and nearly executed, escaped execution by this, skin of his teeth. And um, late in life, he dreams the impossible dream, which is returning home. It would have been impossible for him to do that, but he imagines himself being picked up by a Soviet cruiser and being taken home to be buried as perhaps as a hero. Unrealistic, but the best you could hope for.
Yeah. But this question too of can there be right without wrong? And then is there a right or wrong? Does it even matter at the end
Yeah,
of the day?
yeah. It all is washed away by that final journey. Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, so when people are reading your collection, what do you want them to be thinking?
Oh gosh, I don't. That's a very interesting question. I
Or
feel
maybe when they're done, if that makes
yeah,
it
yeah.
easier, right? They
No,
put it down.
oh, there, it's. I really don't. I mean, I didn't plan that far. I didn't plan people actually reading this thing. But
Of
I think,
course we read it.
well, I think what I would like for them to do is to um, feel some degree of kinship and sympathy for those who have tried to make a home elsewhere, and to find in their own experience something that makes that kinship possible. Because I think we've all gone through this in one way or another. It's I don't think it's a lachrymose book, but I don't think it's in the end a very sad one. But we all make big journeys in our lives, even if we never leave home, and the past leaves us behind, even if we don't leave it behind. And I hope that we can all sympathize with the loss that we all incur as we live. Yeah.
Yeah. So has there been a reaction that surprised you? Are there people who are reading it differently from that?
No, I don't think so. I think I really like the fact that people find it funny. Some critics have noted that there are a lot of decent jokes in there, funny puns and stuff, and I like that, because I think of myself as a hilarious person, and I'd like people to confirm that.
Wow. That's funny, because I mean there are funny moments, but
Yeah.
I really was thinking more of that. I took it as a heavier collection.
It's a
than
heavy.
that.
It's a heavy. You're right. No, you're right, Rachel. You're not wrong. I'm just saying that I do like the fact that that has been leavened somewhat for a number of people by the funny puns.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. So I also wanted to ask you, okay, so one more poem, because we don't have too much time, but I feel like if I get off of here and I haven't asked you this, I'm going to feel bad. Okay. So on page 29, we have Bavel at the Kibbutz. Babel. I
Yes.
don't know. I might have said it wrong.
Babel. Just say Babel.
Babel.
Yeah,
Okay.
Babel.
And I wanted to ask you about this poem, and quickly for the listeners, the reason why I wanted to ask you about it is because there are so many languages in here, right?
Oh yeah.
We have,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm counting, right? At least I'm seeing in English, and then I see some Yiddish, and then we see some names of places, in their
Spanish.
languages,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Spanish. I'm trying to think as I'm looking quickly. I'm seeing many languages in here.
Yeah.
So
There are a few.
as the Tower of Babel would, right? As we,
Yeah.
right?
Very much
As we
so.
sort of go to that. So I just wanted to ask how you thought about this and all those languages in that poem.
Well, I always think of Babel, whom, of course, I love, and I feel a great affinity for, because we're both Odessans, and that means
Yes.
a lot. And I always think of him as
We're
a
talking
person.
about Isaac Babel.
Isaac
Sorry, for
Babel, yes,
listeners,
exactly.
just to be clear.
Yes, Isaac
Not
Babel.
the Tower of Babel, which
Yeah,
I
exactly.
also took
Author
from
of Red
this.
Cavalry and Odessa Stories.
Yes.
I find him to be a person who lived between languages. He was fluent in a number of languages, and he relished the texture of language. He really loved
The double entendre.
Exactly, and just the feeling of it in your mouth, all of these things. And so this being an homage to Babel, I wanted to work that in. And in one of his stories, he has his protagonist, who's very much like him, perhaps him, talk about an uncle who ran away from Odessa, ran from Kiev too, and ended up in the United States, and eventually died in Los Angeles. And the family receives a trunk of his possessions. And so I imagined, being an Angelino, a very proud Angelino, I imagined the life of this uncle, and imagine that it's not very different from my own life, as a kind of damaged emigre, going from bar to bar, and bonded with this fictional uncle, and reunited him with his nephew.
I love it.
Yeah.
And his shady side too,
Yeah,
right?
he's very shady
Yeah.
man. Yeah.
And just the very last line of this sort of summed it up so well, right? The LA sky's a quinceanera by Chagall. Schmils like us, we never quit the pale.
Yeah. However far you go, you're always an Odessan.
Right, and all those languages in there, just
Yeah.
amazing. So,
Yeah.
Boris, we don't have that much time left. So, in 1 minute,
Oh gosh.
I know, no pressure here or anything.
Yeah.
But do you have any advice for new poets out there who are looking to get started or looking to get published?
Oh, looking to get well.
Either
For
way.
poets, yeah, for poets looking to get started, of course, I'll give the advice that everyone gives, which is read a lot of poems, and don't be afraid to. Maybe this is actually this is the opposite of the advice that most people give. I say find something you like and read more things like it. At least when you're starting out, don't necessarily. Of course, you have to read broadly, but if you find something that you really love, that really speaks to you, perhaps even something that you want to imitate. do your best, because whatever happens, eventually you're going to come out with your own voice. It's going to be the reason that you like something is because it has a voice that is a voice that you want to have, that maybe is somewhere inside you and you haven't gotten it out yet. Maybe you haven't even aged into it yet. So keep reading it, keep even trying to imitate it, as embarrassing as the process is, and out of that exercise will come out something that is very much your own.
I love that advice.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, but don't hold me to it.
Boris Dralyuk, thank you so much. For those of you who haven't already read My Hollywood, here it is. The beauty of this cover and this collection. Go out and buy a copy. Boris, thank you so much for joining me. May you sell many, many copies.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you very much, Rachel.
All right.